Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join the Once Again for New York Primary Election and Community Priorities panel discussion tonight. My name is Lakshmi Gopal, and I'm a national organizer at Roots Action and formerly on the Bernie 2020 national organizing team. I'm also a Bronx native and so excited to be in conversation with the speakers tonight, who are going to go in depth about the political landscape in New York, the primary election that's coming up, and what matters most to our communities. So we are once again asking you to get out the vote for Bernie in order to receive more delegates that are going to support our platform. And specifically, tonight on this call, we'll go over how to vote in the New York primary election and why it's important to continue voting for Bernie and other down-the-ballot candidates. And then afterwards, we're going to open up the floor for a panel with some amazing guest speakers to go over voting in New York, setting those community priorities, and discussing call to actions in the state of New York. So let's start off with what exactly Once Again is. We are a political action committee organizing votes for Bernie in the upcoming primary elections like New York's, up until the Democratic National Convention in August. Our goal is to reach the 1,200 total delegate threshold that will allow platforms like student debt cancellation, Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, and an end-for-profit war to head to the convention to be voted on. And so there are still 604 delegates from now until August, and Bernie just needs about 150 more to get to that 1,200. In addition, our delegates will be present on key standing committees at the DNC, and one of the most important standing committees we want to have influence in is the Platform Committee. Every 4 years, they put together the party platform, and this is where we have power to leverage as a movement to integrate our progressive platforms into the Democratic Party by continuing to vote for Bernie. The delegates on the Platform Committee help determine the platforms that Democratic candidates need to support in order to run. All right, so now let's go over how we can actually vote in the New York primary election. So when and where do you vote in New York? So New York actually has two options. You can vote by mail and you can vote in person. And in order to vote in person, there is currently early voting that is happening, and tomorrow is the last day to early vote. Polling places are open from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. in New York City, the counties of Dutchess, Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, Rockland, Orange, Putnam, and Erie. And in all other counties, polls will be open from 12 p.m. and close at 9 p.m. And anyone in line by 9 p.m. will be allowed to vote. And this is for the primary election day, June 23rd. So next Tuesday, so tomorrow, Sunday, is the last day for early voting. And then the actual primary in-person election date will be Tuesday, June 23rd. And if you are going to vote in person, make sure that you're taking precautions and being safe. COVID-19 is still happening, and so we want to make sure you all are keeping your distance as best as possible, wearing a mask, and bringing your own pen. And also in person, you are not required to bring an ID when you vote. However, if it is your first time voting and you did not provide any ID when you registered to vote, you must bring a form of identification when you vote. Acceptable forms include a valid photo ID, current utility bill, bank statement, government check or paycheck, government document that lists both your name and address. The second way you can vote in the New York primary is by returning your vote by mail ballot. So you can do this by mailing in the ballot you would have received by mail already, which you would have had to apply for to get, and have that postmarked by June 22nd, the day before the primary. And you can also deliver your vote by mail ballot in person by the primary election day on June 23rd. And next, we want to go over the delegate process in New York. So by voting for Bernie, you are increasing the amount of delegates he can have for the Democratic National Convention. There are over 274 delegates up for grabs in New York. And if Bernie can win a significant amount of them, we could fill that remaining 150 delegate gap needed to make it to 1,200. These following are delegate-rich areas that can mean a huge turnout for us, and ultimately those platforms we discuss: canceling student debt, passing the Green New Deal, passing Medicare for all, and ending for-profit war. So these districts are District 5 in Queens that has 8 delegates, District 8 in Brooklyn, District 9 in Brooklyn, District 12 in Manhattan, District 13 in Manhattan, and District 16 in the Bronx. So delegates are allocated proportionally, and Bernie needs 15% in each of these congressional districts to receive any delegates. Like we talked about before, the ultimate strategy here around getting out the vote for Bernie and getting delegates to the convention is really to pass those platforms. We need Medicare for all in order to reform our healthcare system, and honestly, because it's a human right to have access to healthcare. We need a Green New Deal to transform our workforce, economy, and energy. We need to cancel student debt that is debilitating our current and future generations, and we need to end for-profit wars that are fought at the cost of innocent people's lives. So we need to vote in the upcoming primaries in New York. And if you have not filled out your ballots yet, you can fill them out live with us on this call. Just go ahead, grab them, and you can do that while you're listening to the panel discussion that we're about to kick off. So let me go ahead and introduce our wonderful guest speakers that we're joined by. First off, we have Darlene Jackson, who is a longtime advocate for systemic changes in child welfare, juvenile justice, public schools, and local government. She's a community organizer involved in several citywide campaigns and is now taking the same energy to City Council in 2021 to represent the 18th Council District in the Bronx. And then next we have Stanley Fritz, who currently serves as Citizen Action's New York City campaigns and political manager, and played a key role in advancing the issue of public campaign financing to the forefront of the 2018 and to 2019 state legislative session through the Fair Elections for New York campaign. Stanley graduated from SUNY Old Westbury in 2010 and previously worked at We Act for Environmental Justice, where as the communications director, he helped communicate the intersections between the air we breathe and systemic racism. We are also joined by Gary Greenberg, who is an advocate, businessman, and former candidate in the New York Senate's 46th district. As a survivor of child sexual abuse, he founded the Fighting for Children PAC and worked for years, holding 17 rallies across the state last year to pass the Child Victims Act and Erin's Law in New York, where other advocacy groups failed. He got it done. Next, we have Sam Jaffe, who is a former organizer on the Bernie Sanders campaign, who grew up in the UK after getting involved in the New York City DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, in 2018 with the races of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Julia Salazar. He is now involved in the DSA's Emergency Workplace Organizing Program and is the relational organizer for Semelis Lopez's campaign in the South Bronx. And lastly, we have Rachel Hims, who is an organizer with the Central Brooklyn branch of the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. She currently serves on her branch's organizing committee and is as a co-coordinator of New York City DSA Brooklyn's Electoral Field Committee. In the past, she coordinated DSA's campaign for Bernie in Central Brooklyn and New York City. She's also a museum educator and an incoming PhD candidate at Columbia University. So first, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us on this panel discussion. You all have such in-depth experience and knowledge, and we're excited to learn from you. And I'm personally excited as a Bronx native and just lover of New York to hear about the ways in which folks can get involved, learn about how to vote in these primaries, and what they should be prioritizing when wanting to advocate for the community. So I'm just going to read off some discussion questions, and it's going to be a free-for-all, really hoping that you all are able to jump in and bounce off of one another. So I want to start us off in so we talked through the specific ways in which you can actually technically vote in the New York's primary election that's coming up. What are the priorities in your individual works, or as constituents yourself living in New York? What are the priorities that you're taking to the primary, and how are you discussing that with your community? I'm going to kick it off to Darlene first.
Oh, okay. So on the local level, right now we're dealing with the city budget, with city council. And so right now, for a long time, the city and state has been very negligent with addressing the root causes of systemic racism and have been over-reliant on our law enforcement with dealing with Black and brown communities. And so, right, all council members to ensure that the budget reflects the values of our communities, and that we defund funding from law enforcement, which right now in total, it actually is $14 billion. When you talk about district attorneys and you talk about Department of Probation and Department of Corrections and the NYPD. So right now the NYPD budget is actually $10 billion if you include like pensions, fringement benefits, overtime, and service debt. And so right now we're trying to have, we're gonna hold council members accountable to at least allocate $1 billion to ensure that the safety net services that provide services on the ground to nonprofit organizations, especially youth services, making sure that we remove police out of all public schools, and that some engagement and not in contact with law enforcement at all. And so right now, that's what's happening on the local level. And I know it kind of interchanged with the state, because right now I can't believe that we're still fighting to cancel rent and it's June. People, that's going to be another crisis once they lift this moratorium that Cuomo, put for, I believe it was June. I believe it was at the end of June, but
June 22nd.
Yes, and so that's another wave of the same community has been forgotten and burdened with now facing of how they're going to pay their rent, from going to March. And so those are the things that's happening. That's a priority right now on the local level that kind of interchanges with the state as well, and the federal, because now people are waiting about the second relief package that, a lot of undocumented people was left out of, people. Because at the end of the day, who's still going to work, we'll have the luxury to stay home, as many of us on this call. I don't want to hog the time. I want to give somebody else to speak, but I'll pass the mic to someone else.
I'll go next. I think it's important that people do vote, and they must realize that it's okay to be an advocate, and it's okay to go out and use your voice, as we've seen all over the country. But the most change we can bring is by voting. And what I did with the Child Victims Act is I held the rallies across the state and in the Democratic senators' districts that were supporting the Child Victims Act, because the Republicans were not supporting for years. So, we went out and got our message out there, and we flipped the Senate because we got people to vote. We got them to come out and vote for Democrats. And that's what's so important. You have to vote, come out and vote for Bernie. You can send your absentee ballot in. You can go to the polls. I know Night Pan's been calling all over the state to get people to come out. And even if you did send in your ballot and you want to, if you unfortunately voted for Biden, if you want to change your vote, you can go to the polls to yourself, and that will count. So get out and vote. It's so important. You can bring so much change. As we've seen in the state Senate, laws that have been sitting in committees for decades have now come out and become law. And New York State is so much better for it. If we can get Bernie, the delegates at the convention, then our voices will be heard much more than if we don't do that. So it's so important to vote for Bernie and the delegates from your congressional district.
This election is pretty interesting because, particularly at the local level in New York State, if right now we have about 38 Democrats in the New York State Senate, if we can win 4 more seats, Democrats will have the supermajority in the state Senate. And that's important because that means that they can then vote on bills that are veto-proof and the governor cannot veto them. That also means that in 2021, during that legislative session, they get to cut the district lines. And for those of you who don't know, that's been a big strategy of the Republican Party to do district cutting in the states that they're in. And they'll cut a line in a way so that it minimizes the power that Democrats have. Democrats are going to be in power and in control of doing that this year if they're able to pick up the supermajority, which means you're looking at a legislative session that might actually eliminate the Republican Party as we know it in New York State if they're able to pick up at least 4 seats this year. So the places where a lot of races are available for Democrats to win this year are not in the city. They're in upstate New York, and places that you would assume would be blue parts of the state because New York is blue, but actually is on the redder side. So in Rochester, there are 3 Senate races right now that if Democrats can win, it can help boost the majority. And these are places that have been staunchly Republican, and they're not anymore. So you got 3 in Rochester, you got 1 in Hudson Valley, you got 1 in Buffalo. So there really is an opportunity that by the end of all of this, Democrats might have 43 to 44 senators, a supermajority, and the ability to do whatever they want. But, for folks who vote for Bernie, that Democrats don't necessarily side with us. That's just the next step in the battle for us. But it puts us in a really good position because we're not arguing on Donald Trump policies anymore.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, I was going to let you go first because you're, prime on electoral stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I'm so glad Darlene started us off by mentioning the issue that is sort of on everyone's mind, and people are pouring into the streets right now. Yesterday in honor of Juneteenth, and for the past 2 weeks, the outsized power that police have to wage violence in our communities. And I think this is a really great opportunity, not just to call for defunding the police, not just to call for a reduction in the multi-billion-dollar budget that they have, but to think about where that money can go. And I think the question here is, what will truly make our communities safer? And if you think about it, often cops are called to act as first responders to people experiencing mental health issues, people experiencing substance abuse issues, to address problems of homelessness, people sleeping out in the streets or sleeping in the subway. I think if we're thinking about what can make our community safer, we're really going to want to seriously consider supporting candidates who advocate for things like the New York Health Act, so universal health care for New Yorkers, who advocate for fully funded NYCHA. So instead of putting hundreds of policemen in our public housing, getting elevators working in those buildings, getting the stairwells and hallways cleaned up, making the necessary repairs so people have heat and water. Those are things that make our communities safer rather than police. So I'm really glad to see that this issue of defunding, disinvesting from police is being paired with reinvesting in our communities, because that's what's really going to make us safer and make us healthier. And so there's so many great local candidates whose platforms on these issues really echo Bernie. Bernie was all about calling for these universal policies like healthcare for all, housing for all, economic justice for all. And there's several amazing New York City candidates who are echoing that in their platforms and who are so quick to take up these demands in the context of the recent Black Lives Matter movement and this ongoing police violence, because it's really all connected, and we can't truly have safe communities without investing economically in those communities instead of just sending cops to arrest people and throw them in jail. So those are the issues that I'm really wanting to see brought to the fore in conversations that our candidates are having right now. And so many candidates have been out on the front lines in the protests, speaking into the bullhorns, making speeches, getting these topics out there, which has been amazing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I actually hadn't let you go first because you took some of the words out of my mouth. But I think one of the really exciting things that I'm starting to take out of a lot of this work is that a lot of the energy going to the Bernie campaign, a lot of the passion of younger people who, maybe are getting involved in electoral politics in a new moment, are also seeing the other side of the coin, right? I mean, it's a lot of the people you're seeing in the protests, or the uprisings at the moment, are younger folks, are people who maybe got engaged a little bit in protest movements in the past few years, but really seeing a huge surge in that right now. And for me, taking those issues, and working between the streets and the movements behind electoral candidates is so important. There's a lot of interaction, I think, as Rachel pointed out, between particularly left candidates, DSA-backed candidates, where we're seeing a coalition of groups get behind those candidates who, work on different issues, whether it be housing, which I think is a particularly big one, at least for Sam Elisa's campaign, in the South Bronx, but also, as Rachel mentioned, healthcare, where, in that district, both the environmental costs and the healthcare costs that are interrelated are immense. And the way COVID has hit that is particularly kind of poignant, bringing all those issues together into one. So I think there's a great amount of hope and potential of, coming out, voting, not just because that's voting is enough. It's not, we all have to be doing more than that, but to come out, support a candidate, get involved in a movement that makes you, feel a little bit less isolated in these times, and do it for an issue that you're passionate about, which I think, all of us on this panel share. There's things that will bring us out, and we know these issues are interconnected as well.
Thank you all. Wow. Just coming out straight with all of the facts and just like important contextualizing of what people should be doing, what people should be caring about. I appreciate all of those answers. I personally am a resident of Congressional 15, and so very much what was mentioned around the need for housing or the effects of COVID and how it has to be, hit the streets and vote. It can't just be either. And I think that's really, I'm watching that happen in my community and all through the state and nation, actually. Just people are being mobilized to understand local elections, to understand down the ballot candidates in a way that was not necessarily the case before, understanding where the money is going and what that controls. And I think specifically around how Movement for Black Lives has been able to give us the language around defunding the police and what that means. Where does that money go? How will it affect other aspects and other fabrics of our existence, especially in New York State and New York City. And so I would like to hear more about, what are we talked a little bit about the necessity to vote and what the priorities are in New York. I'm curious as to how these platforms, Medicare for All, Green New Deal, ending student debt, these platforms that we're hoping to be able to have negotiation power along at the Democratic National Convention, if we're able to get enough delegates, how would those be transformational for communities in New York?
Policy doesn't change the world. Policy doesn't stop oppression, but sound, strong policy that shifts power away from those who always have it to those who don't can do something called structural change. And structural change doesn't just change the law, but it changes the facts on the ground. I have arguments with my friends about this all the time, but I'll use it in this case for you guys. I think the Affordable Care Act was a policy that caused structural change. Here's why. Because before Obamacare, people didn't think it was weird if you didn't have health insurance. That was a normal thing. And it wasn't weird to pay money for your health insurance or pay a lot of money for it. After Obamacare, people got used to a certain lifestyle of being able to have health insurance. So when the Trump administration came after it, people pushed back and they fought back because health insurance became a right. And when you're talking about free college tuition, when you're talking about Medicare for all, when you're talking about housing policies that make it easier for regular people to have homes, you pass those bills and make them laws. They don't just change the law. They change the structural grounds that we're dealing with. So all of a sudden now, it's not a debate about whether housing is a human right. It just is. And it's not about whether somebody deserves housing. It's how do we get it for them? So, as we're pushing for this election to come happen, and we're pushing to make sure Bernie has enough delegates, that's really the thing that we're debating about, because we get this on the platform and we get even one of these things through, it shifts the entire conversation and it allows you to go even further than you have before. So for folks who have been doing this for a while, it's a bit exhausting, but that's really what the fight is about, because the electoral game is a contact sport, just as politics, but it's also a slow hustle. So you have to have the patience, and pieces like this help to change the conversation.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that we definitely have come a huge long way in advancing popular support for the policies that Bernie's campaign represented just in the past few months, especially as the COVID-19 crisis makes people realize how badly some of these are needed. And if you look at New York City right now, many people are worried they won't be able to pay for treatment for COVID-19 or complications ensuing. Lots of people are getting sick with COVID and then ending up with subsequent conditions that are putting an immense cost burden on them. We also see in terms of worker protections, Bernie was a huge advocate for worker protections, for people to have stronger rights to unionize, for those unions to have stronger powers. And now we see how badly that is needed in New York, now that essential workers are being asked to labor without hazard pay, without adequate protective equipment. And I'm heartened to see that many workers, even non-unionized workers, are taking the opportunity to stand up and fight back and go on strike until they get that hazard pay, until they get those masks and gloves. But I think, when we talk about structural change, which was just mentioned, I think a huge part of what we're dealing with, both on a local and national level, is trying to remove the profit incentive from things that should be human rights, like we talked about. So, for instance, I was just reminded yesterday that just about a year ago, Con Edison shut off the power to Black residents in central Brooklyn and Brownsville and other related neighborhoods. Someone brought that up in the context of Con Edison having shared a post celebrating Juneteenth. And the sort of rebuttal was, how can you claim to celebrate Juneteenth when just a year ago you shut off the power to Black residents in this city? And for me, it really reminds me, well, what's Con Edison's incentive to provide good service to our communities? What's Optimum Internet's incentive to provide good service to our communities? Their motive is to make a profit, to turn a profit on things that should be a human right, like power. And I actually think like internet, it's the same thing with healthcare. And so definitely the ACA Affordable Care Act did a lot in terms of pushing the envelope to make people think actually, I do deserve healthcare. I need healthcare to survive. My children and family need healthcare to survive. I think we're going to continue to push the envelope and really asking the question, should people be able to make a buck, make $1 billion on withholding care or providing minimal care to people who desperately need it? I think those are kind of the structural changes we need to see. And that's why it's so great that both Bernie and many of our local candidates are refusing all kinds of corporate donations, refusing real estate money, refusing healthcare money, refusing police union money, refusing money from all these sources to which they don't want to be beholden because they're trying to represent the people. So I think that's one way in which sort of campaign finance is intersecting with these broader demands. And it's great that so many local candidates are taking this route of turning down that kind of money.
Yeah, and just to jump on that, I think that's one of the really exciting, legacies of Bernie, and also proof that, people and coalitions of groups can pressure candidates, right? We don't just, Bernie knew that it was about, not me, us, and he would declare to be an organizer in chief if he had won. And I think a lot of the candidates are saying the same thing, right? They want to be pressured. They want to be pushed. They know the effect that getting elected to Congress can have on a lot of folks. And they know it's important to keep being pushed on those issues. And I think, jumping off what Rachel was saying about, the issues in New York, particularly around unorganized workers and this massive, jump in worker organizing and wildcat strikes, all these exciting things. I mean, Juneteenth had the International Longshore Workers Union, one of the most militant, unions in the country, take strike across 9 different major ports in the U.S. I mean, that's exciting. That's the first time I had heard of that happening in years. So I think it's giving confidence to people. It's giving particularly working people confidence that, when you see someone like Bernie run, when you see local candidates run who are working people, who are working class, you give everyone else a sense of confidence, a sense of something can be done, right? So definitely, I think the DSA's program of the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee that has been, specifically focused on gaps where unions are not reaching out to unorganized workers, workers who are trying to organize during this COVID crisis to get basic protections, PPE, hazard pay, pay time off if they get sick, really obvious things that I think, affect almost all the people across New York City and New York State. And I think there's often, the upstate, downstate divide and a bit of a feeling about that. I think on issues like the Green New Deal, that everyone comes together on that. I mean, obviously the climate crisis is going to affect all of us, but whether it's the upstate New York farmers or folks in more deindustrialized areas, because it's not just the Midwest that has been deindustrialized, who need that support, who need infrastructure. It's also the New York City subway. It's also the MTA. It's also the massive health consequences that have come with systemic racism that mean that massive highways are built through parts of the Bronx and kids have a much higher level of asthma for that reason. It's bringing in all those different issues and fighting on them, knowing that, this isn't a fight between upstate and downstate, or between, you know, union workers and workers who are not yet unionized. It's bringing folks together on those issues for fight for a common policy, I think is really great.
So I'm gonna jump in right after Stan. This is Stan, right? Because he brought up the Bronx, and so when I think about you know, Bernie's platform, you know, the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, student debt, and you think about COVID-19, you think about the Bronx. Just think about the Bronx alone. The Bronx became the epicenter of the COVID-19, and it's because of, you know, poor legislation that was supported and passed by our elected officials, right? People who've been complicit of systemic racism and oppression in our communities, and we got hit the hardest. The Bronx became the epicenter. The Latinos was the highest death rate. Next was African Americans, and so you think about, you know, it's not just about passing a legislation and making the law. It's really about and structural changes. It's really about oversight and transparency, but really about holding people accountable. Yes, you pass how many bills, but how many of those bills actually transform people's lives and the conditions of how they live, their living conditions. And so I think it's not just about voting for people, about their policy platform, but it's really about holding them accountable throughout their whole entire duration while they're in office. You know, making sure that those policies that they put into place are really reflective and really transforming people's livelihood. And so when you talk about, I'm sorry, I almost lost my train of thought. But so I kind of really want to hone in is that, yes, structural change comes with oversight and transparency and accountability. It doesn't stop at the voting booth. You have to be making sure that the people you elect into office with the policy, the platform. Let me just give you a case example of Mayor de Blasio. This man ran on the platform about the tales of two cities about fighting inequality right here in New York City. I have not chased. This is probably the only mayor since in all my activism that I had to chase at every corner of the city on a platform that he ran on and promised New Yorkers that he was going to tell the two cities into one city, and he has failed miserably. At this point, and so it's about really holding people from, you know, tooth to nail. And so when you talk about Bernie's platform, as soon as COVID-19 hit, they was running around trying to get protections for everybody. But these are the same issues that this man has ran on that it fell on deaf ears because our own Democratic Party, I'm sorry, they're not doing as well. I'm sorry, this is not about just going down the ballot and just voting blue all the way. No, because it'd be your own people that's not really being bold enough and having the political courage to do what's right for their own constituents, to making sure that the laws that they're passing by or the budgets are reflective of the values of all of the districts, not just their voting base, of even the people who don't vote for you. Those are your constituents at the end of the day. And so it has to be reflective of everyone that's within your community. And so that's what I have to say on that. Sorry.
I just think you said that's such an important point. Our relationship with our elected officials does not end once we cast a vote for them. Whether they're Democrats, whether they're Republicans, we need to keep demanding what our communities need from those people. It's not as if we can just assume they're going to do what's right for our neighborhoods and our communities, because there's other factors at work and they might not. So I think sometimes people have the idea like, oh, like if the Democrats in office, it's all good. It's not all good. And I kind of like to imagine, even if we had gotten a President Sanders, I'm sure the people would have been sort of, you know, holding camp outside of his office, banging on his door to hold him accountable, to make sure that he would do what he said he was going to do. And so when our local elected officials are obviously not as far left as Bernie, obviously aren't going to enact those same radical demands that we were fighting for, we definitely need to be showing up and holding them accountable and not easing up on them at all. And I just think you said that so well, Darlene.
I just wanted to say that the most important issue I feel in the 46th district is the New York State Health Plan. Everybody in the state deserves to have good health care, and no one should have to go bankrupt, as we see in this society. So as it was mentioned that we need 4 pickups of state senators, not only would it give them a supermajority, it would give them veto power over the governor. And so, I think that's important. As we've seen with the governor, he's done a good job, but, he has a lot of power. So when is he going to give up that power and get back, to give the legislature also should have power. And, laws like that he hasn't pushed the New York State Health Care Act and, the Green New Deal and other laws we need to get through this state. And the best way to do that is, as I said before, to get out and vote. I mean, voting is so important. You can go on the streets and march and do all that, and young people, but we have to get them to the polls and vote. And that's what ultimately will bring the change that is necessary in this society.
Well, while Lakshmi just jumps back in, I just wanted to add to that discussion, and particularly what Darlene was pointing out about holding, and Rachel, holding people to account. I think when we're talking about voting, part of what we are voting for is to get this platform that we really believe in on the table of Democrats, because at least, whether, the eventual nominee, the eventual president, fully is behind those policies or not, we don't know. But if it's on that platform, we can hold them to account on that, right? We can say, hey, you signed this. This is your platform as much as it is ours. And at that point, whether it's a Green New Deal or Medicare for All, we can make sure they put the energy behind that, make sure they put the pressure that they need to put on behind that. And I think that's really important. If we're talking about Bernie's delegates, that's where that power comes from, holding whoever has to, have that platform to account once they're in there.
Definitely. Just listening to you all talk just now, what came to me is that AOC said at a rally yesterday for Juneteenth that oftentimes elected officials are deemed leaders, but really they're enacting and mobilizing from public opinion and what's happening in the streets and what's happening from other aspects of the political landscape and the social fabrics that we have of mobilization and of power dynamics. And so making sure that we're voting, but there are many agitating and mobilization pivots that can also be happening. And so just thinking in that regard too, like we're talking about holding elected officials accountable, what are other ways in which, so folks are going to vote in the New York primary. What are they doing after that? What organizations are they getting involved with? How are they part of the marathon of holding elected officials accountable, but also doing the work of understanding what their community priorities are? Who are the power agents that they need to be moving and shifting to reflect community priorities? And so organizations that people could be joining, movements that they can get involved in, different ways that they can show up after going to the polls.
They can get involved in candidates' campaigns that support, the causes that we believe in. I think this election is, it is the most important election. We have to get rid of the President Trump. And so get involved in candidates, congressional candidates, state Senate candidates, and, help these candidates win, get out the vote, make phone calls, a lot of work to be done in the campaign. So that's what my feeling is.
My first suggestion would be DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. That's an easy one. And I probably shouldn't say that one first because I represent Citizen Action. But that's a great organization, politics tier 1. Next up, Citizen Action of New York, my organization. We're fighting for social, economic, environmental, and racial justice. All over New York State. There's also Vocal New York Communities for Change, Writers Alliance, Black Youth Project, just to name a few organizations that you can get involved in. You should volunteer for campaigns, but I don't think you should volunteer for a campaign as an individual. You should volunteer for a campaign through the organization or the community group that you're in, so that you can use that volunteer time to flex electoral power. Politics is a contact sport. What that means is after election, that's just the beginning of it. You still have to be having constant contact and constant engagement with an elected official. And that starts off with a nice ask, But then it can move from a nice ass to pulling up to the office with 50 people in the district saying, you're ignoring us. We need answers. That could mean going to the Capitol building where they do their business and saying, we want this bill passed. It can mean showing up in front of their house at 2 a.m. and waking them up saying, you're ignoring these bills, so they have to be a priority. But like the way that you do that is through the way we've always done it. It's with community power. And you can find community power in those organizations that I talked about, or you can build that community power on your own in your own community. Because whether like the group of folks you're with has a name or a 501c3 or 4 behind them, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is, are these people in the community who have seen their power, they care about an issue, they are focused on accomplishing a goal, and they want to work together. Because if they are, you don't need a citizen action or a DSA or a book or anybody. You need that. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, getting involved with the campaign is really good. I'm really active right now, volunteering for our local candidates, Jabari Bridgeport for State Senate and Ferris Front Forest for State Assembly. I was actually at their campaign office all day today doing all kinds of random stuff because we're getting out the vote and there's a lot of stuff to do. But yeah, win or lose, these campaigns eventually have to end. And then what do? That's why I definitely agree it's really good to be working with campaigns through an organization that can kind of be like a political home for you. I mean, for me, I think there's like so much going on. There's so many issues. I love being part of an organization and I can kind of turn to it and sort of learn from people I work with, learn from people I organize with. Like I'm always learning in these organizations and also, organizing. So like I'm in DSA and I really encourage people to join it. We have branches in North, Central, and South Brooklyn, Lower Manhattan, Bronx and Upper Manhattan, Queens, and Long Island. So wherever you are, there's a DSA branch near you. And it's just like, it's a community where we learn together, learn about politics together, but also take action. Right now, something the DSA is really working on is calling and contacting city council members to demand that they defund NYPD. Last year, DSA ran a really long campaign to get Hakeem Jeffries to sign on to co-sponsor a bill that in support of universal health care, and that was a successful campaign. So these organizations really interface with our elected officials, but there's other spaces we organize in too. I don't know if maybe Sam would want to say more about this, but another great organization or to pick up and getting involved in is your workplace, your union, if you're in one.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I can't underestimate enough, the difference it's made to me getting involved in workplace organizing. Because no matter, for a lot of folks who don't necessarily have as much, energy or time or capability to be, constantly in the streets or constantly doing electoral organizing, as important as those are, for folks who work and, the vast majority of people who are able to organizing in your workplace is an incredibly politicizing moment. And you don't go through, some of the typical discussions you do in electoral politics where, you different ideology or you differ in this or that. Workplace organizing, unites people around a single issue that they want better workplace conditions. And I think seeing some of the interactions that I've had through that, I mean, I can speak really highly of DSA's program, EWOC, to do that and talk more about that. But I think what it does is, through DSA and the electoral organizing part and the labor organizing part, you're seeing, you're meeting incredibly varied people and learning incredibly varied skills. What you learn in electoral organizing, you can bring to labor organizing. You can bring to community organizing or issue organizing. And the same going, in different directions. It connects organizations and campaigns together in a really exciting way where, you'll see campaigns and elected officials be pressured by these groups once they're elected. I think it's some of the most exciting things we saw in the Bernie campaign were its interactions with movements, right? I saw in Florida while I was there, National Nurses United coming in their nurses gear, in their scrubs and knocking on doors. And that's a powerful thing, right? We saw in Iowa the incredible organizing by folks who, stayed up, went to the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift outside the factory gates of a meat packing factory, which of course right now is a hotspot for COVID, and talking to them about electoral politics, talking to them also about union politics. We also saw that in Nevada, right? Union politics goes both ways. There are good unions and there are better unions. We want better unions. And I think there's a really exciting connection where we're seeing, among different movements, among different political groups with these different issues. Those who are responsive to it are doing well. You're seeing officials who aren't responsive to movements, right? And I think when you see that, you see them struggle. So politicians are also picking up on this, and that you will see some of them be more responsive. But, words are not actions. People have got to be held account. We should have politicians saying, you know what, don't listen to me, watch me, right? So I would really, like to see more of that for sure.
So I would like to add, so I think like once people submit their ballots or go to the polling site, that, when we talk about community organizing, that comes with a lot of political education that needs to happen in our communities. Because I find it, I don't waste my energy of like talking about structural changes to non-people of color, because the hard work really comes with doing that work with my own neighbors and my own family members and my own peers. Because when you talk about systemic racism and the conditions, how oppressed our own people, that they can't see, when they correlate safety with police, because that's all they know, that's all they see, and they don't understand that the police cannot provide housing for the homeless, or they cannot provide treatment for people suffering with substance abuse and mental illness. And so there's a lot of political education needs to happen. At the same time, we need a lot of community healing, because as you see, every day we're seeing how people die at the hands of police, images, videos, and we have to live with this every day, right? And then we sitting with a budget where they're putting $6 billion, $10 billion on a priority on law enforcement, then the safety net that keeps our communities trying to thrive. Well, actually survive. Then we're not thriving yet. That's what we're trying to reach. But I think that you definitely have to like organize and, whatever issues that you care about, connect with organizations, grassroots organizations that you connect with. So a lot of the folks that are on this call, like Citizen Action, Vocal New York Communities for Change, Make the Rogue New York, Just Leadership USA, Riders Alliance, as Stanley mentioned. These are folks that's on the ground that I see value in the issues that they care about, that impacts my life and the residents that in my district. And so it's about really aligning yourself with grassroots organizations that's really pushing the envelope about the issues that you care about, but also holding people. You gotta have a strategy. It's because we could sit here and march and protest all we want, and it's very necessary. But I feel like you bring that energy right back, and you have to mobilize and organize and really come with your own community-based planning. And when your community-based planning comes with holding those in a position of power accountable. It's not elected officials telling you, dictated to you about what they think was best for you, when you the residents know. It's a relationship. It's an open door policy, and so you have to really create a space of what you people fear the unknown, but it's time to really reimagine. We talk about defund the police and defund the Department of Corrections. It's really talking about reimagining public safety for Black and brown communities. That that everything has been the answer to law enforcement. When all we need is to replace those officers with people who are expert in those populations, with healthcare workers. Limit as much contact and replace them with people who are experts in that field. And so it's a lot of political education, a lot of healing to unpack all that untreated trauma that people have been endured for so many years, and really have come to lead to transformational results. But you really have to, it's all about electing but that comes with electing the right people too. And so as the young man has stated, yes, voting, you could get involved with candidates, but you really have to support them. Running a campaign costs money, unfortunately. And I don't, and so I think it's about really aligning yourself with and putting people who will be bold enough to challenge the status quo, to really have transformational results that's going to get us free. Like, we're not here to get any crumbs. We're not here to be sitting here begging for the most basic necessities. And I think that's where we at. And I think we need to seize the moment until the 100 power, until we get the results that we want. That got me hyped up.
No, I love the energy. Yeah, no, definitely. I think personally, as an organizer, as a lifelong New Yorker, I couldn't agree more with what everybody's talking about. How it's a multi-pronged strategy. There's many ways to get involved. There's so many organizations. And you really just have to focus in on one, what issues are important to you and what issues are important to your communities, and then how you can utilize your time and energy, which are very, very important and very valuable. How can you use those two things to get involved directly to address those issues that you care about, that your community cares about, and also vote? There's a multi-pronged strategy. There's many ways to do this. This conversation it's just so riveting, and honestly, I think it really just highlights the many ways in which folks can get involved and should get involved, and shows that there's space for everyone in this fight collectively. And so that's it. Super refreshing and powerful. I would love to end the panel with a question that I heard on. So the Movement for Black Lives had this weekend in celebration, 619 weekend celebration of just events to celebrate Juneteenth, but also call for particular demands, like defunding the police and such. And one of the questions that I heard asked during their live stream was, what is your freedom dream? What is the thing that if we got all these things passed and we could hold our elected officials accountable, what would freedom in New York look like? A sentence or two of what that would look like if we were in a place in which that was feasible, that was attainable. I would love to end the call on that.
That's difficult. I'm going to just quickly go, not based as much of my own experience, but Sam Elise, whose campaign I'm involved with, has a really brilliant discussion of talking about why the South Bronx is so brilliant. What does freedom look like? Freedom looks like the best parts of its history, where salsa was started, where hip hop was started, where some of the most brilliant radicals and poets came out of, the Harlem Renaissance and parts of the Bronx as well. Some of the most inspiring figures in politics as well. I think it's appreciating that history and seeing what that could look like in the future, which I don't know.
Free New York City to me. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
To me, it would be, we're all treated equal, and we need to bring so much change. The court systems. I mean, I was knocked off the ballot because I'm an insurgent candidate, and the court systems, as we know, are really two justice systems in this country. One for the poor, one for the rich. And there's so many things out there that need to be brought change. When a person of color can run for political office in the suburbs and win, I know a lot of suburbs in upstate New York never had a person of color, Afro-American, in as a elected official. When those type events happen, and that's what we have to work for, to change people's thought process. And we're doing it, but it's a slow process. But when we can have, one equal justice system, and we can put people forward that to run for elected office, that everyone will accept and will vote for, then we'll have the freedom that everybody is entitled to. Until that day comes, we won't have that freedom.
Freedom in New York City looks like, to me, it looks like a beautiful Saturday afternoon. A bunch of us are at a barbecue somewhere. We're playing City Girls. We're not worried about the cops coming and harassing us. No one is worried about having to come up with money to pay rent, because that's not a problem we have anymore. Everybody has what they need. Everybody feels good. It's just fine. And that might seem very simple, and it also might seem very unrealistic, but it's very achievable, because we have all the things we need right now to make sure everybody has what they need, and we're just not using it right. So that's my vision of freedom in New York City.
Oh, that's a really hard question. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is equity, right, and reparations. That's been long overdue when you talk about people of color, right, and what does that actually look like through legislation or budgetary items, right? So when Stanley's talking about housing, like real affordable housing where people with the homelessness doesn't exist in New York City, where people are not going hungry. I'm not going hungry, but I think it's just the most basic necessities met, like financial freedom, like really putting wealth back into the hands of the most forgotten, the people all the way at the bottom who's been sitting there for far too long because there's no upward mobility, because you have systems in place who has kept them there for too long, and that's the Bronx, right? You have all these systems. HRA, a public school system, a housing system that has kept our people at the bottom, at the very bottom. So I think when we talk about freedom, is like really uplifting our people to upper mobility where they could really thrive and live with dignity. So that's what comes to my head when I talk about freedom.
I love it.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question, and I feel like everyone would have a different answer to the question, what is your specific freedom dream? But probably they would all have elements in common. I mean, thinking about a freedom dream, like I imagine, a family, a parent, whether they're a single parent, whether they're partnered, they have, they're paid a living wage, and they're paid a living wage for a reasonable amount of work. So, when the weekend comes, when the evening comes, they have time to spend with their family, with their children, but also just to be themselves, to follow pastimes and pursuits that interest them. I think what's really one of the things that is sort of saddest about living in a society where you really have to fight just for your basic necessities is that people don't have time or effort, or they're too tired to discover things that interest them, and to take some time to develop a hobby, a creative passion, to even take time to go on vacation, get out of the city. People just don't have time for that. And it's just like the grind of working and the bills that crush us down. So for me, freedom is like that. So the freedom just to have time for yourself and for your family. And it's like a really simple thing. But there's so many factors, including like fear of violence, minimum wage, lack of health care, lack of housing that make it impossible for so many people.
Thank you all. That was just so beautiful. I was quite inspired by that question and figured that this panel with you all doing just the immense amount of on the ground and also intentional work for communities, I felt like you would be the people who would know what freedom looked like for New York. And so I really wanted to extend that question and end on a beautiful, positive note of what all of this work, voting, getting delegates to the convention, joining these organizations, having those dinner conversations, the one-to-one mobilization moments that we have, just all of this work is towards that. It's towards ultimate freedom. And like it was said, it's different for every person, but there is commonality there. And so I just want to thank you all. Very grateful that you were able to hop on and talk about the New York primary election and just this state and city that I love so much. And so thank you all for watching tonight. So if you want to join the efforts in getting out the vote for Bernie specifically and bringing this platform to the convention, you can go ahead and sign up at onceagainpac.com/volunteer. And we'll continue the fight in the next couple of weeks until the convention. And then please also look up the organizations, the candidates that the panelists have mentioned, and follow our speakers. They are powerful voices doing the work. They're individuals who are plugged in and know where we should be spending our energy and time right now. I know a lot of us are feeling lost, especially with COVID happening, what's happening with this new wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's just so much confusion around where we're supposed to be putting our time and energy to actually make an impact. And these are the individuals who have been plugged in for a long time and understand where we should be doing that. So please follow them. And just thank you all for a wonderful conversation about New York and the primary. And please remember to vote. Thank you.